Sure, I can kick us off. Do you think we're live? Yeah, maybe? Just assume I'm gonna reload the event. But yeah, thanks so much everyone for joining. Um, we have a wonderful panel today to talk about the role of people analytics in preparing for the future of work. We're so lucky to have these four folks from various places and backgrounds. So we're just going to jump right in, and I'm going to go ahead and let them introduce themselves and a little bit about themselves. So why don't we start with Dan? Thanks for joining.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Rachel and Stephanie. When you all invited me to speak, and then I saw who I was speaking with, I've been looking forward to this all week. This is like, and I say this sincerely, not only incredible minds and thinkers, but friends, and I love that. So it's pretty special when that all comes together, when people that we know and we've grown up with in this space and worked with and had drinks with and get to come together and do this. So this is awesome. So I am Dan Riley. I'm the co-founder of Radical. And simply put, at Radical, we unlock epic work experiences for everybody. In a world that is changing left and right and up and down, we believe that organizations need and must do better for their people. And that means utilizing new people strategies, new science, new technology that's intentional, focused, simple, and ultimately empowering the individual and driving the necessary behavior change and making work better. So that's what I do every day, what I believe in every day. And I can't wait for this amazing conversation around how important the role of people analytics is. So thank you for having me.
Okay, great. Roxanne, you want to go next?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, thank you so much for having me join you today. I've known half of the people on this call for quite some time, so I'm super excited to be here. I'm an industrial organizational psychologist by training, so my entire career has mostly been around talent. But what underlies that is this really strong measurement and analytics piece. So I would say I've been doing people analytics before we called people analytics people analytics. I also am a certified executive coach, so I do some of that on the side. And I work right now for a smaller tech company leading the people analytics team and really work cross-functionally across our entire people team, supporting all of the different businesses. So again, thank you for having me. Super excited to be here with the panel today.
Okay, great. Who wants to go next? How about you, Mark?
Yeah, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Yeah, Mark Hansen. I work at Lightcast, which is a labor market intelligence vendor, but my heart is in people analytics. I spent 5 years at United Health Group, helping run the people analytics team there. So deep roots there. So I've been around this world of people analytics and labor market information for 10 years and a little bit in my management consulting days as well. But yeah, just so fun to be on the panel with friends and folks that we get to hang out at conferences with and share memories with. So a lot of fun minds on this. So thank you for including us, Stephanie and Rachel.
Okay, and Ben.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. So also really, really pumped to be on this panel. So I come from a little bit of a different background, which is labor economics. I started my career as an academic labor economist, and I teach the future of work at New York University, but really started my corporate job at IBM, where I was running workforce analytics at IBM, and started getting to know all these IO psychologists and all the wonderful people in this space. And it's such a small world, and it's just a great community. And just thought, I really want to start something and do something in this space. So I started Revelio Labs, which is a workforce data company. And the goal there is to kind of bring the sophistication and ubiquity of data that we see in places like finance and marketing to HR and to this space, to people analytics mostly, but HR kind of broadly defined. And sort of the dream is to, have good, clean data everywhere you want it.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for introducing yourselves. Again, thanks for joining the panel and sharing your specific experiences with people analytics and how it's affecting our future of work. So I just want to say thanks again for all who are on the stream listening. You know, we're so excited to be on our fourth panel of our series, and I think this is going to be another great one for you all to listen in on. So feel free to type questions in the chat as you have them, and we'll get to them. But we'll kind of kick off with our first question around what is your definition of people analytics, and how is it becoming increasingly important in the context of the future of work? So Ben, you're still big on the screen, so why don't
Sure.
you
Get the
go
big
ahead
question
and
first.
tackle this one?
Sure,
and
sure.
we can,
I'll take a stab at it, but it's a tough one. So I think, you know, I came into people analytics in like 2015-ish. And I think people analytics primarily is really working on projects. I think it's a very project-based function where you know, there's people analytics teams, and the primary responsibility, I think, is to analyze mostly internal HR data to improve the operational performance of the business. And that's pretty much it in a nutshell. So the clients, if we want to think of it as like, you know, sort of consulting type work, are business unit leaders. Mostly, sometimes they're HR or strategy or whatever, you know, like more kind of, you know, corporate functions, but they're you know, leaders who want to improve the operations of the business. And mostly the idea is that there's a ton of employment data, and that information is not really rigorously analyzed. It's like 2/3 of the expenses of every company, and does not have the same efficiency and seriousness as even more minor expenses. So there's this you know, real disconnect between what's really important for a company and what gets a lot of attention. So I think people analytics teams typically have a lot of really interesting, important work to do, and are probably under-resourced on average. And then there's an interplay, I think, between talent intelligence, which, and those lines are blurring a little bit, but talent intelligence are typically, they do a lot of talent acquisition work, whereas people analytics a little bit more talent management, and talent intelligence, you know, takes in a lot more external data, and people analytics is a little bit more internal data. So those lines are blurring, and I think sometimes, you know, people analytics do, you know, teams do a fair amount of benchmarking also. So we're kind of getting to a point where just the analysis of data related to people kind of can sit within people analytics. So I think that's really what people analytics should have purview over. But right now, I'd say it's a little bit more focused on internal data related to talent management.
So interesting. Does anyone else want to kind of go off that on their definition of people analytics and how it's going to impact the future of work?
Yeah, I'll add if I can. So I'm going to add a little bit of twist, and it's getting back a little bit to my background as an IO psychologist in this space. So yes, and to everything Ben said, I also think there's a really important piece that I think a lot of definitions or teams I see that is missing, which is the measurement and assessment of talent with research-based, statistically sound, psychometric-based tools and practices, right? So I think there's a piece of kind of doing the work and the delivering work. And then there's also that element of bringing in your foundational skills around the talent lifecycle, around how to develop good tools, around how to measure the reliability and validity of different tools, to really ensure that the things that you're doing and the things you're measuring are built off a really strong, solid foundation in terms of what you're doing and what you're delivering. And I will say, and the panel had a chance to chat for a few minutes before we joined the bigger group today, is, you know, there's a real, in my opinion, like an organizational readiness factor when you think about how you define people of analytics and what you're ready to do when you think about the future of work. There's some businesses that are really kind of at the foundational stages, getting the data models together, building out the fundamental kind of reporting strategy. There's some businesses that are doing the super fancy, all AI, all predictive work. And I think every organization is kind of somewhere along that curve. I also think you can be multiple places on the curve at the same time. So I think a lot of the answer depends on where does the organization sit right now in terms of your journey overall.
Yeah, I love that. And if I could just add one more layer to that, I both what Ben and Roxanne said, I completely agree. I'm going to add more of just a kind of a simple human response to what it is. And I'm going to start with what it's not. What it's not dashboards, it's not reporting, it's not mean scores, it's not data represented on a screen, right? People analytics, if done correctly, drives change. It drives behavior change and it drives organizational change. So if you're not using it and you're not actually reimagining what change, what human change, what problems are we trying to solve for by leveraging data, you're not leveraging a successful people analytics strategy. So everything we do in people analytics ultimately is resulting in some sort of behavior change. And behavior change happens at the individual level. Individuals make up teams, teams make up functions, functions make up organizations. So I always want to just put that real simple layer of human behavior change is a critical outcome and the only outcome, successful outcome of people analytics.
And
I love that, Dan.
Yeah. Oh yeah, Rich, I was just going to add that we almost see this in the naming convention of what we used to call, it was HR reporting, and then it went to talent analytics, and now we're at this people analytics term that is starting to catch on. There's still a whole various names being used, whether it's including workforce in the name or other things. But what I love about it is this switch from a job-centric focus for HR to a people-centric focus, and so that goes along with what, Dan's spot on. It's behavior change. It's what are we driving within our organizations? And so people analytics, I think the title is a little bit ahead of its time because, to Ben's point, it's still kind of siloed in this area that people don't really understand. But as the finance teams are starting to realize, like, our people, it was easy to manage when we had an unlimited workforce that we could tap into, that we could always hire. Now it's like, no, there's a limited talent pool that we can tap into. We have to start taking care of our people through mobility and training and in keeping the folks that we have here. So it's become a much more complicated problem. And people analytics has moved from that reporting and dashboarding space to now we actually have to weave this into our strategic workforce planning. We have to weave this into our talent acquisition strategy, into all the talent experiences and management functions that we're creating. And so I love that the data is being harnessed appropriately to drive that change, and it's getting the C-suite finally being exposed to that, and it's becoming elevating that importance and the employees to the benefit for that movement.
Yeah,
Thanks so much, Mark.
Actually, just to piggyback on what Mark and Dan and Roxanne were saying is that we mentioned this is not dashboarding, but the data has to come together in some way. So I think what Mark and I are kind of working on respectively is kind of that upfront data consolidation effort, which really isn't a good use of time for these, these change agents and IO psychologists and experts who really should be focusing on how to best improve the business. But that data stuff has to come together. So I think this is kind of, there's a little bit more segmentation between what's centralized, kind of on the vendor side, and what's actually done by practitioners who know the ins and outs of the business. So I think we've seen this more like healthy division where kind of the upfront data consolidation work sort of happens, from an external data, centralized place, and the change management happens internally. So that people analytics doesn't become this kind of reporting and data consolidation team.
Yeah, I love that. I'm going to jump to our next question, but I do think we'll get back to some discussion on data pretty soon, because I know that's a hot topic for some who are interested in this space. One thing I did want to get your opinion on is we see a lot of new things come up in our LinkedIn feeds, a lot of popular press articles talking about ChatGPT, generative AI, how it's going to change the future of work. But I'd love to get from your perspective in your organizations, what workforce trends do you believe will significantly affect organizational strategy, and how can people analytics get ahead of that and prepare us for that? So, thinking more broadly, or maybe it is ChatGPT and Gen AI, but what are you thinking about and seeing in your work that's really important? Anyone want to get going?
I'm happy to jump in with a quick response to
Yeah.
that. There's so much we could talk about there. Obviously, AI is changing everything in many ways. That's a whole nother webinar. Certainly, and of course, hybrid and remote work and understanding how we can be more productive and gathering data there, mental health and well-being. These are things we have to stay more attentive to, making sure there's resources available. And again, I think people analytics can play a huge role in that. So, I think those are the probably some of the key elements that I would just quickly put out there. But I'll leave it there. I have a handful of other responses, but I think that's I would say remote work, hybrid work, mental health well-being, and then I would just say building trusted connectivity in the workplace. We work with the way we work is different now, right? We work in cross-functional teams. We work in remote ways. Hierarchy of the workplace is sort of a thing of the past, right? How we learn, from a learning and development standpoint, how we gain mentorship, understanding your people, understanding and being connected to people in the workplace at the right place at the right time, when you need them, where you need them, why you need them. These are things, again, having data on people, understanding people, what their needs are, where they're trying to grow, how they're trying to develop, and then presenting people an opportunity. To me, that is how data is going to change the world within the people analytics context. So those are some of the trends top of mind.
I'd like to add on to that quickly, because you touched on two things specifically, Dan, I would have mentioned also. And what I really love about what you said is you're talking about putting the people back in people analytics. I think sometimes we forget a little bit that's what it's all about. And so when you touched on kind of well-being and mental health, as we all know, that really came to a higher level of importance and awareness kind of during the pandemic, but that has not changed, right? Like any article on LinkedIn, look at the work Microsoft is doing, other companies around measuring this. I don't think we're at a place where we have a grasp on that. And I don't think a lot of companies are truly considering the measurement aspect of how is this impacting our efficiency, our productivity, our collaboration, our ability to get our jobs done. So I still think there's a huge, huge opportunity around that. And then the remote thing, same. This is not a new thing for us anymore, but a lot of us haven't figured it out. How do we collaborate in a distributed work environment? Does going into the office or being near an office create higher levels of feelings of engagement, satisfaction, productivity? And if yes, how do we ensure that the people who don't have the ability to do that can still have that feeling and still thrive and be very efficient and productive in the same way? So I think we're all still on that journey of figuring that out. And I think that will continue to be a big factor as we go forward.
Yeah.
Agree.
Yeah, I agree with that. First of all, putting the people back in people analytics, but also putting the analytics back in people analytics. So, so yeah, I think all of those are important. And certainly, there's generative AI, there's remote work. I think also a longer term trend is just the relationship between employee and employer has been changing for decades. People don't stay at companies for a long time. Work is shifting from being more, repetitive task based to being more about knowledge work and connectivity and discovering what to work on in a more organic, decentralized way. So I think that creates a lot of complexity in kind of old school approaches to management. So I think we're very far from this like Taylorist, regime of just like optimizing work tasks, and I think there's this really tricky question of how does work actually come together? Someone gets hired into a job, which is maybe a set of responsibilities, and those are listed on a job posting, but is that what the person actually does? Maybe it evolves, maybe it adapts to new technology or different teams, or team changes or business challenge changes. So when that job transforms, is that the manager saying, now, instead of doing ABC, I want you to do, B, C, D, or is that, you know, from the employee themselves actually saying, you know, I think this thing is unproductive. I want to do more of this, less of that. So I think that there's this interplay that is, I think, poorly understood today about how work actually comes together. And there's some process which determines what people do in their jobs. And that determines how teams interact and how functions perform and how the organization transforms, like Dan was saying. So I think kind of understanding, you know, what do people actually do? You know, how is that changing? How does that adapt to technology? How does that adapt to new business conditions? Is just a really hard scientific problem. So I think it's going to take a lot of, you know, IO psychology horsepower and labor economics as well to kind of get to the bottom of this. So I think these are the big grand challenges of our field over the next, you know, decade or so.
And to summarize that, it's the complexity of work is what is so hard to put a finger on. We used to call a job by a job title and everybody knew what that job title meant. Now companies are making up job titles that you don't even know the work that they do because it's so obscure or it's vague. But to Ben's point, underlying, the task shift, the responsibility shift as business shift, as the economy shifts and as the business pivots to new, new things that they're working on, and how do we do that? One of the pleasures I get is I get to talk about skills all day long, every day, because that's a core piece of what we bring through our data and through the trends that we're tracking. But that's where I see this really cool trend with companies that are saying we no longer can manage our company based on job titles. Like there's so much underneath that, the work that we need done, the technologies that are disrupting our flow, the things that we need to start digitizing and automating. We need to shift how we think about work. We need to shift how we do the work. And there's this push to get more precise and granular. And so one of the ways where a skills-based approach is helpful in this space is it's helping us give that peek under the hood of what something historically was very vague to describe. How do we get more precise in that language to describe this work? And it has a long way to go because, to Ben's point, it's very complex for how we deal with measuring this, defining it. But I'm excited for that workforce trend that we can get more skill centric. We can get more focused on there's people behind all these jobs, and how do we think about those people versus how do we just think about these job functions that need to get accomplished? We're putting some personality back in that decision making.
I think that's great. I really appreciate all of your takes because I think you're kind of identifying some really foundational things that we don't see very often mentioned, how work gets done, how people are grouped, job titles, which we talked about last week. So I think you're hitting on some really key things that are, I would say, honestly, more important than the hot topic, the hot button items that we get sent into our inboxes. So I love that. And then thank you to those in the chat who are chiming in with their own thoughts. I think digitization is so important, for people analytics to stay on top of, and some of the other things I see in the chat. I do want to kind of keep us moving because I know we have quite a bit to get through, and I think the next topic will be really interesting for our attendees. It's around talking about data. What are some of the key data sources and metrics that organizations should focus on to kind of anticipate future workforce trends? So, what have you seen in your organizations that's worked? What do you wish you could do? What data do you wish you could have to really set your organizations up for success? But I think, data's everywhere, but what would you focus on for the future of work? Mark, do you want to start, or you want to kick it off to someone else?
You might have to kick Ben and I out because we're going to be extremely biased in our answers.
Okay, I'll cut you off if you go too long.
No, I'm happy to promote Ben. So Ben and I get the pleasure of working, and we have actually done some collaboration. So we're not true competitors at heart, which is a good thing. But yeah, at Lightcast and Revelio, I mean, we're both bringing external labor market intelligence, and that's through aggregate data gathering from supply of people profiles, resumes, looking at all of the job posting data that can be gathered to measure the demand of what are companies actually looking for. And so those are just two great external sources that you can bring to this space to say, how do we enhance our internal metrics with an outside perspective so that we can get that 360-degree view of talent, because your talent decisions aren't made in isolation to say, well, how do we move people around? you always have to be backfilling jobs. When you're a growing firm, you're always looking externally to buy that talent. Where do we buy that talent? How do we optimize the internal workflow so that we can, optimize our costs in the background for, when do we promote? When do we, train and develop? When do we go out externally? And so you need that external purview. So this was a pleasure that I got when we were first starting up a talent intelligence function underneath the people analytics umbrella at United Health Group, which is where Stephanie gets to work now with my old team. We were able to say, yeah, this is so important for understanding where are we operating the talent pools that we need to be tapping into where we can't, because as talent pools were shrinking in a lot of these markets where we had large call centers and things like that, we had to get really creative for how do we source new talent from early career and be able to train them up. Well, where do we find that? What schools do we partner with? So it heavily influenced our talent acquisition strategy. And as we moved more into understanding the complexity of our jobs, it moved us into the skills-based realm of saying, how do we understand what skills are out there? What's the supply and demand? How does that measure with the internal supply that we have? How do we strategically move those pieces on the chessboard to optimize, the outcomes that we are looking for? So very biased there. I'll let Ben, you fill in with your perspective.
Yeah, for sure. I agree with everything you said. And I think there's so much opportunity to look at the external market, but both like from a market analysis perspective, but also there's an opportunity to get more granular and look at companies themselves. So I think looking at the profiles, the postings, even the sentiment, these are really powerful data sources. And I think it gets very exciting when you can look at your own company and say like, all right, what is the attrition rate of key roles? How does that look relative to peers? What's the skill composition at this company versus that company? I mean, there's really no strategy without differentiation. And I think, having that external view is so important, and could also be just much faster than having to go through a whole project and pour over internal resources, and then at the end of the day, not know what's happening at your peer companies. So I think I'm definitely an advocate for looking more externally. I think that's really important. Another thing I'll say, just on, aside from the data, so I think bringing in all these data sources is really useful, but also I think another thing that's really important, and I'm sure all of us on this panel have obsessed about this at some point, but it's the job architecture. It's actually, how do we organize this data? The data itself is a mess. It's always a mess. I've never met a data set that wasn't a disaster. And to get that organized, you really need to categorize, job titles to occupations, skills to skill groupings, responsibilities to sets of activities, also job titles to seniority levels. There's all this structure that needs to be imposed, on the data. And I think that's where things get really nice and neat and very powerful. Once you have this data set up in a nice, neat, tabular way, then it can be embedded in a traditional analytics workflow. You can run statistical tests. You can do all sorts of cool things with it. But I think getting that structure and like developing those taxonomies, I know like Mark and his team have done a tremendous amount of work there. We do some of that too. I mean, it's just like, I think you've been in the space too long when you get really excited when people talk about taxonomies. But I think we're probably all there.
I know you're speaking my language. Dan or Roxanne, do you have any thoughts, other data sources that you really value when you're looking at the future of work?
Yeah, I'll just add in one thing, and part of this, I've also have a consulting background. I've done some stints really around pre-hire and developmental personality assessments, and I think that piece is often missing when people think about their traditional people analytics kind of data sources or foundations from an internal perspective. We're not often considering kind of that personality-based assessment, because this is more about how you're going to work and maybe where some of your opportunities are around the leadership development piece, right? So I think it merges really nicely with the skills stuff. I don't think we do a good job overall of integrating that together, and I think it's a big missed opportunity with a lot of potential there to really elevate the way we think about what do we need in the future, who do we need to do it, what are the different types of competencies, skills, abilities, all of those things put together to really be successful in the future.
I love that, and I'll just add one I don't think I could add any more, specific data sources. I want to just add a little bit around how the data is used and how we should be thinking about it in a new context, right? In a 2025 world and beyond. We have to be leveraging this type of data and thinking about it more as momentum versus arrival. And I'm going to explain what I mean by this. We too often have leveraged a lot of great data, and we have a lot of great data sources, but we give ourselves arrival points, right? The KPIs. Versus leveraging data that is focused around momentum of change, right? Data that enables and allows us to see, are we enabling agility, creativity, innovation? Are we leveraging ideas to flow across teams, across departments, throughout the company, right? So again, I think it's a mindset shift and an opportunity around how we start to look at data. It's less about arrival and it is much more about momentum, because momentum allows us to continue to move, right? Arrival means we've somehow arrived and there's a box checked. So I think it's real important to think about leveraging data as it drives change, momentum, agility, creativity, innovation, and all the data sources that panelists brought up, I think are super, super important, and especially some of the external data. I completely agree with all that.
Yeah, I really appreciate all the different takes. I think it's so interesting to think about it, like you said, Dan, in terms of momentum, because I think while there's so many short-term needs and a lot of ask from our business leaders, you really need to be setting up your data for the long term if you're going to be successful as a people analytics group and really make those changes in the organization that you want to make. So I think you make a great point.
And I would just add, I would say move away from the binary mindset to the progression mindset, right?
Yeah.
Binary meaning sort of we've hit a target, we didn't hit a target. Really, really dangerous way to use data. Not to say there aren't times when we have to look at data very, very, very precisely, but momentum is powerful. That's movement. That's wind behind your back, wind behind the organization's back that allows you to succeed.
I think that's great. And I actually think this is really great segue into our next question around more of the role of people analytics and how it will evolve in the next 5 to 10 years. Like, I think we've already seen this shift or maybe more conversion with talent intelligence, because I think a lot of times teams operate with just the data they have. People analytics, is a newly-ish field, and so they're working with internal data. But now we have all this external data that we could potentially get on the market. So, kind of going off of that, what do you think the role of people analytics will be in the next 5 to 10 years, or what do you hope it will be as you look to the future of work?
Yeah, I'll tell you what I hope it will be. And I'm
okay, go Ben.
Sorry, which one's gonna go?
No, you go, Ben. That's great.
Okay, sorry. I'll tell you what I hope it'll be, and I'm reasonably optimistic that we'll get there. I think having worked in finance for a little while, the way that people work in finance is that they've got their computer in front of them where they're doing their day job. And right next to them on a separate monitor, they have a Bloomberg terminal, which is all the data they could possibly want. They know everyone else is looking at the same data. They trust it. It's like very vetted, it's like all the data they could want. And that's their job. They have the stuff they need to do to perform, and the data. And there's this interplay between the workflow and the data that's like very, very seamless. And I think that's where we're headed. So I think we can unify all this internal and external data and do that kind of in an upfront way to empower every person within people analytics to just have that data sort of at their fingertips, ready to go as they try to improve performance. So that's one dimension of where I think we're headed. Another is that I think we're already seeing a lot more integration of people analytics with other business metrics. So sometimes you have just the HR data, data from an HRIS or an ATS or whatever, and then you also have retention, data on client retention, or data on, whatever, like sales or other performance metrics. And you try to make these associations and correlations, and try to predict if we institute XYZ policy, what effect will we see on the bottom line on this or that. And so I think we're seeing this relationship between employees, employment data, and the business metrics. And so I think, and this is a little bit out there, but I think people analytics will cease to be all about people. I think it fundamentally will be about the business. And I think, nothing happens in a business without people. So I think coming from the people perspective as a starting point is a really, I think people, the people analytics function is very well positioned to be this kind of like general business improvement project team. But I think that's where we're headed. I think coming from the people lens to just find ways to just like really efficiently and seamlessly help, improve business objectives. I think that is where we're headed.
Can I add on to that? Because that was
Yeah.
where I was going to go, is like, people analytics is about people, but it's also around driving business performance. That's why we're here, right? Like, that's fundamentally what we're trying to do. And I started my career in people analytics, called something very different, in a retail organization. And oh my goodness, I thought the data was a mess, and I would give anything to have that unit of analysis at the store level data right now and have that consistency across businesses. But we very proactively linked engagement survey data to customer data to financial data to leadership data. And we created a model where we could predict, based off of increases or decreases in satisfaction, engagement, and different metrics on the customer side, what the bottom line downstream impact was on a store's performance, right? And I think there's some companies where you have that data readily available, where you can and should already be starting to do that. And that was our way to really get to the senior leaders of the companies, to show them the financial impact. I think in some other organizations, we don't always have those really hardcore metrics to deal with, so it's a little more challenging. But when you can, you must absolutely integrate hard outcome business data into your strategy to really start to show the value of how are you actually driving the business forward.
Yeah, and I would echo all of that. It is, and again, I think what you just said, Roxanne, and what you said, Ben, absolutely true, that ultimately everything we're doing is to drive organizational change. Mm-hmm. To do that, right, behavior change, we have to drive behavior change to drive organizational change. So there is I love, you said earlier, Ben, we need to put analytics back in people analytics and people back in people analytics. So that's true. They both hold true. We do need to do a better job. And what I hope, back to the question of what it is in 5 to 10 years, that it is more integrated, right, across employee experience, across customer satisfaction, across onboarding, across compensation, across applicant tracking, versus siloed. It's getting better, but it's still in some cases a siloed function. And people don't think about employee experience categorically. They think about it as an experience, something that happens. It was good or bad or great or indifferent. They don't categorize it. People analytics shouldn't either, when it comes to storytelling and driving organizational change. So so my hope is it's just more part of every day. It's more storytelling. It truly it's less of a pull approach, right? Where you need to go somewhere to figure out what to do. It's just embedded in the day, and there's clear understanding and articulates where we are, where we need to be, where we're going at any given time. And I think we're getting there, and there's a lot of great opportunity to get there. But it's going to take a lot of alignment and a lot of commitment across functions within organizations, which is one of our last questions, I think, around what are some of the blockers, which.
Yeah, I think so. And I think it's so interesting kind of what you have highlighted, because there's one part of people analytics where we do need to be more connected to the ROI of the organization and the business outcomes, and really, make those connections so that we can seem like a valid and necessary piece, not just a nice to have team and an organization. And then there's also the side of people analytics where we care so much about the storytelling and the data and the kind of the I don't know, it's just like the nice fluffy pieces that don't always get as valued, but they're still important. It's just harder to make that connection to the bottom line. So I love kind of the mix of answers, and it's a great way to think about this when we don't always take the time to think about it. I'd love to look at some of the questions from the chat before we move on. I think there's one from Mark that I'd love to answer about kind of looking at the skills approach and wondering if it can pull us in too deep. So do you think we can get so refined with the skills that we miss the bigger picture? So a little bit more about that skills approach and how do you tackle that?
Yeah, absolutely. There's definitely a risk there, but what is happening, especially with AI and generative AI, and making this a lot easier to do some of this work, and then the system improvements for how much data the models can handle and how much is the functionality of all of our core HR systems have really stepped up to be able to handle skills a lot better. And so I'd say we've seen wonderful technology improvements where, 10 years ago when I first started in people analytics, that was unheard of. Like we couldn't even tackle that. We barely understood job titles. We couldn't add another more granular element to start to analyze, but now the systems have caught up. The interconnectivity and the integrations are so much more powerful than they used to be. And then the amount of, to Ben's point of like cleanliness of like how we have to get the data in the right spot, even more of those parts are being automated. So between the computing power and being able to handle more of these complex scenarios, we're ready for this change, and it will only get better in the next 5 years. But I see as skills are, to me, the connective tissue between learning and work. So it's one of the fundamental ways for us to understand how do we target learning, how do we prioritize learning, how do we look at our talent internally and externally, and what are we looking for? How do we mix the uniqueness that we're looking for all of these complex tasks and work that needs to get done? Skills gives us that language to be able to do that analysis at the right level. So I don't think it's overwhelming. It's actually going to be optimizing for companies to go after this. And it's piggybacking off of the last question we had, where it's like, where's the trend going? Well, we're talking to more finance leaders now with CFOs saying, I can't handle the turnover cost, and the cost of talent is so expensive. How do I continue to optimize and reduce turnover, because it's crippling our bottom line from a finance perspective? So finally, people analytics and the CPO and the CHRO are getting a seat at the table with the C-suite to say, how are we solving for this? How do we understand the mobility throughout our organization? How are we understanding our workforce planning needs, and are we being as strategic as we can be there? And so skills gives us that ability to be more strategic and more precise, and it's also going to help us have that regrettable losses when we do have to do RIFs. I'm hoping that senior leaders be like, we should pause before we do a big RIF. Are there people sitting behind those job titles that actually have skills that are needed for the growth areas in our business? Are we getting down to that level? So I think it's to the benefit of all employees and for good business practice to say, let's look beyond the job title, get to that precise look at skills, and that's going to help us make better decisions to redeploy talent so we can reduce the turnover, because companies can't afford to do RIFs anymore, especially with how expensive the talent is becoming in a shorter labor, a shortness of the labor pool that's going to be available to them. You're going to have to start poaching from other companies, and that raises your costs 30 to 50% in some cases on externally hiring that person. So skills is going to give us the mechanism to get there, but we have a long way to go because it's still in its infancy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Just to piggyback on that a little bit. I mean, I think there's so much potential to quantifying these things and breaking them down. Of course, this isn't going to replace all strategic stuff. This is like, going to improve operational efficiency, which is also really important. But I would maybe even go further and say that, like, understanding how we can break, these individuals up into skills is really important, just to get a real, like, data-driven approach to, like, what are people unlocking when we hire them, when we lose them. So I think that's really critical. But if we think about skills as sort of the building blocks of the capabilities of a person, I think if we think about the building blocks of jobs, and this is something, Mark and I debate sometimes, is, I think of the building blocks of jobs as work activities, or tasks. So I think we can break jobs down into pieces, and those are activities or tasks, and then we could break people out into pieces, and that's skills. And I think having this connection between skills and activities is really, I think, it's so powerful. So I think when we get there, we can really start to actually quantify the relationship between employment and work output, which is going to become even more important because, of course, employees aren't the only parts of a business that can produce things. There's also machines. There's also AI. There's also non-traditional workers like freelancers, et cetera. So I think being able to quantify the relationship between what we get when we hire someone, what we get when we lose someone, and the actual business outcomes requires this breakdown into skills and this breakdown into activities and how those relate to each other. So I think having that framework, that architecture, can just unlock a lot of value for the organization.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's a really great point. I think it kind of, we've been kind of talking about AI a little bit in these conversations and how it's helping us get further along in these areas faster. And we did have a question in the chat around whether you guys think AI could do people analytics for us without an expert or an analyst kind of helping it along or maybe prompting it. So I'm kind of curious, from your perspective, do you think we're at the point that, an AI program or bot could do people analytics, or does it need someone there to do it? Kind of just maybe a little controversial question just to get a sense of what you guys think generative AI might be doing for good versus for bad for our field, or neutral, however you think. Anyone want to start?
Roxanne, I want your take, Roxanne. I think
let's let Roxanne. Yeah.
Was I making a face when she was asking the question? So I think if you are in people analytics and you are not using generative AI in some mechanism, some way right now, you're missing the point. And even if it's something simple, I had recently put up a job description. Guess what helped me write the job description? Generative AI. Guess what helped me come up with some of the standardized interview questions? So there's very simple ways that everybody should be using it right now that really apply in the HR space. Will AI ever take over people analytics? I'm here to tell you, absolutely not. In a million years, will it completely take over everything that we do in this field? It's just impossible. And I don't think that's the intent of AI. And I think there's this fear that it's going to take over a lot of things. And I think we're a long ways away from that. There's certainly some more kind of repeatable tasks that it can start to take over some of the tasks, but I don't think it will ever be like a perfect replacement for what we do as humans, right? And so you even think about, a lot of what a people analytics team does on the consulting side is have meaningful strategic conversations with leaders around what their talent priorities and strategies are. What does this data mean? What do we do with it? What are some kind of possible follow-ups or interventions? AI is not necessarily going to be able to have that sort of humanistic interaction with humans that I think will always be a fundamental part of a lot of what we do.
Yeah,
I agree.
Well said. I would add one thing in just a funny little story. I don't know if anybody watches The Daily Show. If you don't, it's on Comedy Central, and Jon Stewart, who's one of my favorite satire comedians and political thought leaders, this last Monday he took on AI and talked about it, and it was funny, but talking to everyone from the CEO of Google to Mark Zuckerberg from Facebook to Microsoft, you name it. And everyone was saying, well, what can AI do for us? And it's like, well, AI can solve our climate crisis. AI can solve disease. And then he showed a video of AI can also make really good toast. Mark Zuckerberg was making toast. And so, of course, the joke was, yes, there's a lot of potential of what AI can do. And then Jon Stewart's question to the audience was, so what are we using it for now when we could be solving our climate crisis and we could be solving disease? And so the point of the conversation was, is there incredible potential? Yes. Are we there yet? No. And to Roxanne's point, I completely agree. Is AI going to do everything? Absolutely not. Is it going to allow us to speed up? Yes. And if we're not using AI for repetitive tasks right now within people analytics, we should be. So I challenge anybody who's building people analytics platforms or using it internally, teams using it. AI should be leveraged, but it's not ready to take over yet. Because if it was ready to take over that, it should. I would rather have it start to solve personally climate change and disease.
Right.
Yeah,
Like, let's
totally
start there.
agree, Dan.
Who's ready to do that? Let's do that first, and then we'll serve. But anyway, it's a funny segment.
Yeah.
Which I think is relevant to this conversation.
I think it's such an important point because, you know, when you read these, like, you know, insane McKinsey reports about like how AI is going to displace, you know, X percent of workers, I think that's, first of all, like, insane, and you know, methodologically flawed, but also I don't know anyone who thinks that we're close to running out of productive things to do as a society. I mean, you know, if we take people analytics as a microcosm, a lot of time, you know, people spend a lot of time, too much time, dashboarding, reporting, pulling metrics for someone who wants a metric. It's not a good use of time. You know, these are, like, you know, brilliant, ambitious people who are you know, overqualified for some of that work. And, you know, and even strategic workforce planning. I mean, very often strategic workforce planning is not strategic at all. It's just, you know, operational workforce planning. You have some set of metrics and you figure out a way to fill them. And it's just not a good use of people's time. So I think there's a lot that can be automated and replaced, but there's just so much to do on top of that I think we can just get more ambitious in what we want to accomplish. And I don't really see a scenario where we as a group, you know, we as a business function kind of run out of good ideas of what to work on.
Makes a lot of sense. Well, I know we're coming up to the end of our hour, so if you have any more questions, feel free to pop them in the chat. But I did want to touch on kind of one of our last questions to generate some interesting discussion, I'm sure. So whoever wants to go first, we can just chat more about what are the biggest barriers you found to adopting people analytics in your organization, and how have you seen, like, your teams or other teams navigate the challenges that they run into in terms of implementing people analytics to do this work for the future? Because I think we can leave the attendees with some kind of actionable thoughts and, you know, experiences to take with them. So any barriers that the biggest barriers you've run into so far, or want to talk about? Why don't we start with you, Mark, or
yeah,
who?
I was going to say, I can speak to just like my personal story. When I first started at United Health Group, we were about 8 people, the size of our team, doing people analytics. And when I left 5 years later, we were 68 people. And the reason why that growth happened was all of the barriers that were reduced. And the biggest barriers were, one, politics. So the leaders didn't even take HR seriously, and they kept them in a silo, and the data wasn't important for the big business decisions. Well, it took a few crises of, you know, whether it was a problem in a location or it's a, you know, chief operating officer needed a new answer. Once we started displaying the power of people analytics and the insights that we could provide to answer big, large questions, it just blew up. And now all of a sudden the executives saw the value of it. We had a seat at the table for big strategic conversations. And it was, you know, everything from real estate strategy to, you know, big, you know, transitions for the workforce and, you know, diversity and inclusion initiatives. We finally had people, they intuitively didn't know about the data that was available. So part of it was non-intentional, that it was siloed. Part of it was just education and awareness and doing road shows to show the capabilities of what the team can do. And then once they saw that our insights could be more data-driven on all these big multi-million-dollar decisions, they completely changed the invitation to the game, if you will. And so now we had a seat at the table. And when you have a seat at the table, you also get more resources and more technology spend and all the things that helped enable that. So one of our biggest ways to reduce barrier was getting the champion in the C-suite with the chief operating officer to say, this is valuable. I'm willing to put dollars behind this. And it wasn't HR constantly defending all their spend because they're in a cost center. It was finally the operating teams are like, nope, we need this. This is critical to our future of our operation. And it completely changed our focus. So I'd say the one of the ways for orgs that aren't quite there yet is find that executive champion, educate them on the power of this data, educate them on the team's capabilities, and also just plant the seed that if we had more resources, here's the additional things we could be doing, and we can't do it all right now because everybody has limited resources. So how do we enable that with tech? How do we enable that with people? But that executive champion is so critical.
Yeah, I would echo that for sure. So there's a lot of political barriers, but also I think I would recommend being really cautious with what you start with. This may be an unpopular opinion, but don't start with reskilling. Don't do it. It's too hard. Everything, you need to do all the job architecture stuff, and you need to, have business incentives aligned, which is so difficult. So I spent 3 years on a reskilling project, and it was not, I don't know, it was not as successful. So I would say, really be careful with the project you're starting. Make sure you've got the right people aligned. Also, a lot of barriers. So I think it's very difficult to get a handle on the data. So very often, when you're going through a project, you find someone who kind of owns this database, and you're like, what's this column? Is there a data dictionary anywhere? No, there's never a data dictionary. And the person who, maintained that data set left the organization, and no one understands what this variable means. You have to really do a lot of detective work to understand what's the precise definition of this data. So I would start much more simply, be comfortable with things that are directionally meaningful, but don't try to bite off more than you can chew in terms of getting really a lot of organization around all the data, because a lot of companies don't have the ability to have a 68-person people analytics team. We were lucky at United Health Group and IBM. We had big teams, but even then it was really challenging. So I would say, another sort of plug for external data is that even if you don't have anyone in your people analytics team, I think you can get a first approximation of, workforce dynamics in a company, even from external data. Sometimes you see more about your own company externally than you see even in your own internal data. So I would say try to not bite off too much. And that would be my advice.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point. Small wins are kind of how you can get off the ground. So, Dan, Roxanne, you want to add anything around barriers and people analytics and how to tackle them?
I'll give 1 minute and then the ending note, so Roxanne can do the mic drop. So really fast. I think just picking up on what Ben said, really simply, less is more in many cases. And be super, super careful not to strive for immediate perfection. Expecting perfection, as we know, we brought it up many times today. Data can be a mess. Data is complicated. Pick and choose the critical areas of opportunity that you're looking to change within your organization. Find the data consistently, put it together, keep it tight. Don't over design, right? I think and less is, like I said, less is more. And the best analogy I have, the best restaurants, there's a reason why the best restaurants have small menus, right? Because there's 4 or 5 things that are designed by the chef with purpose, with intentionality, with care. If you go to Old Country Buffet, there's a lot of food, a lot of options, but the quality isn't as good. So don't create an Old Country Buffet with your data strategy and your people analytics strategy. Do the fine dining approach. And alignment. Get alignment across functions and leadership.
Yeah, so I love what Mark said about get a sponsor advocate that's maybe outside of the people team or the HR team. I think that was kind of what I was going to go towards. But I also think what I've found success in, and it's a work in process at every company I've ever been at, is dispel the beliefs that executives hold really strongly about certain things using data. If there's one way to get someone's attention at the top, it's to tell them they're wrong and come with receipts and show them how. So that's been one of my strategies in the past.
I love it. Well, thank you all so much for your time and your insights today. I think they've been really powerful as we all kind of think about our current people analytics strategies and how we need to be setting our organizations up for success, or just kind of what we want to be working on in our own, spare time to kind of get better in certain areas. So thank you so much for all your time, and thank you for attending. Oh, one more thing we need to pop up before we leave is this amazing graphic. We did want to highlight that we have actually 2 more sessions, but 1 more planned session next week on career pathways in people analytics. And we're also adding a surprise 6th session because we've had such a great time organizing these, and we wanted to really touch on listening at scale. So how people analytics is leveraging employee listening to drive employee experience. So it'll be a great panel with some really exciting employee listening representatives. So hopefully you guys can join that in a few weeks. But thanks again for joining another session. We've really enjoyed it, and we enjoy all your feedback and comments. So thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Have a great weekend.